The galaxy was at peace, a vast and tranquil expanse where hundreds of different alien species coexisted under the rule of the Galactic Council. From the mighty Soren Empire to the wise and calculating Vrax, the galaxy seemed to be a place of endless order. But that peace, that calm, was about to shatter in ways no one could have imagined. The Galactic Council had been the voice of authority for centuries. Their power was unquestioned, and their rule absolute. They had seen countless species rise and fall, crushed rebellions, and ensured that no one was strong enough to challenge their authority. But beneath this veneer of peace, a storm was brewing, one they could neither predict nor control. It all started with a signal, the kind of signal that made many of the council members chuckle when they first heard about it. It wasn't much, just a strange pattern coming from the farthest edge of the galaxy, a place so distant that only the bravest of explorers dared venture there. The signal was weak at first, almost imperceptible, like the faintest whisper on the wind. For weeks it lingered in the background, a curiosity more than a cause for concern. We've analyzed it, and it seems to be nothing more than a natural occurrence, one of the senior council members stated, dismissing the report with a wave of his hand. He was the leader of the council, and his word was law. There's no need for panic. The galaxy is secure. We've nothing to fear. But there were others who weren't so sure. A few scouts, those who spent their lives exploring the edges of known space, had started to report strange readings. They spoke of something new, something different, moving beyond the range of their sensors, but not quite like any species or phenomenon they had encountered before. Still, the council paid little attention. They had dealt with far greater threats, and the galaxy had always come out on top. The reports were dismissed as the ravings of overzealous explorers. After all, the council had been in power for so long, and no one had ever dared to challenge them. Why would anyone start now? But then the signal changed. It grew stronger, clearer, and unmistakably deliberate. It was no longer just a random fluctuation in space. It was a message. The once quiet signal pulsed rhythmically, like the beat of a war drum echoing across the galaxy. It was as if it was calling out to the Galactic Council, daring them to listen. Alarm bells rang in the council chambers as the signal continued to grow. It was now clear that the source of the signal was not from any known species. Whoever or whatever was sending it had no record in the vast archives of galactic history. The peaceful balance the council had enjoyed for centuries was starting to feel like an illusion. Perhaps we should take a closer look, one of the younger members suggested, his voice edged with concern. We've never encountered anything like this before. It could be important. The leader of the council scoffed. You're all overreacting. It's just another anomaly. The galaxy is far too vast for us to know everything. There will always be mysteries at the edges of our reach. But even as the leader spoke, there was an uncomfortable weight in the air. The others exchanged uneasy glances. Something didn't feel right. The signal wasn't fading. It was only getting stronger. Finally, a fleet of scouts was dispatched to investigate. The decision was made almost begrudgingly, and the council made sure to downplay the significance of the mission. A small fleet, with limited resources, was sent to the outer edges of the galaxy. They were to find the source of the signal and report back. But in their minds, the council knew it would be a simple task, just another errand for their military to handle. The scouts set off, their ships traveling through the silent void, the distant stars casting a cold light across their path. They moved closer to the unknown zone where the signal was coming from. But as they neared, something began to feel off. The space around them seemed to throb with an unnatural energy, and the signal became deafening. "What is this?" one of the scouts murmured, staring at the instruments on his console. This isn't right." Before he could say more, the fleet's communication system crackled to life. It was a report, but it was jumbled, distorted, filled with static. The words were almost impossible to make out, but the one thing that stood out was a single phrase repeated over and over. "We are the Deathworlders." The signal cut out suddenly, and all contact with the fleet was lost. The scouts were gone. Panic spread like wildfire through the council chambers. A few of the more seasoned members began to understand. This wasn't just another anomaly. This was something they couldn't ignore. Something, or someone, had breached their territory. Something that had the ability to destroy everything the Council had built. The Galactic Council had underestimated the threat. They had dismissed the warning signs, thinking they were invincible. But now, as the minutes ticked by and the message from the Deathworlders loomed larger, they'd realized their mistake. The galaxy, which had once been so safe and predictable, was about to face a new kind of power, a power they could not control. The Deathworlders were coming. As the Council scrambled to understand what had just happened, panic rippled through the galaxy. The disappearance of the scout fleet was only the beginning of something far more terrifying. The signal from the Deathworlders had been a warning, but the Council didn't yet know the full scope of the threat. The Deathworlders weren't just some random race or forgotten species. They were a deadly force, one that had been watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, that moment had arrived. The Council, still in shock, tried to maintain control, but the fear in their voices was unmistakable. They quickly sent out a message to the other factions, hoping for help. But no one knew what they were facing, and even if they did, no one was eager to fight a battle they couldn't even begin to understand. The first true encounter came within a matter of days. A small, unassuming colony on the outskirts of the galaxy, one that had never seen conflict, suddenly found itself under attack. Ships of the Deathworlder fleet appeared without warning, emerging from the void like shadows in the night. They were massive, gigantic warships that dwarfed anything the Council had ever seen. They were battle-hardened, scared, and sleek, built for one purpose: to fight and win at all costs. Their weapons were unlike anything the galaxy had ever known. Massive beams of energy that could slice through the strongest shields with ease. Their speed and precision were unmatched, and they showed no mercy. The first message from the colony came through. "Help. We're being attacked. Please." The transmission was cut off mid-sentence, leaving only static in its wake. It was clear. The Deathworlders were here, and they weren't going to stop. The Council reacted quickly, sending one of their most powerful fleets to the colony to intervene. The fleet arrived to find the colony destroyed. Nothing remained but ruins and charred wreckage. The Deathworlders had already moved on, leaving no trace of their attack, except for a few messages broadcast across the galaxy. "We are the Deathworlders. Bow or be crushed." The Council was stunned. They had never seen such utter devastation in their lifetimes. Entire fleets, some of the most advanced and feared in the galaxy, had been wiped out in the blink of an eye. And still, no one knew who or what the Deathworlders were. It wasn't long before more reports came in. Dozens of colonies were attacked. Cities were leveled. Entire systems wiped off the map. The Deathworlders moved through space like a tidal wave, unstoppable and relentless. Each strike was more brutal than the last. The Council's attempts to fight back were pitiful. Their best fleets, armed with the most advanced technology, stood no chance. The Deathworlders didn't just fight. They destroyed with an efficiency that was almost alien. They didn't fight like the other species the Council had encountered. They fought like beasts, with a primal fury and an unyielding thirst for conquest. The messages from the Deathworlders kept coming, each one more chilling than the last. "We are the true rulers of this galaxy. All others are weak. All others will fall." The galaxy was beginning to tremble. The once mighty civilizations that had lived in peace under the Council's rule were now facing a nightmare they had never imagined. They had underestimated the Deathworlders. They had dismissed them as nothing more than a threat on the edge of space. But now, they'd realized the truth. The Deathworlders were no mere alien race. They were the galaxy's worst nightmare come to life. And they were just getting started. As the first true wave of destruction spread across the galaxy, the Council could only watch in horror. They had failed to protect the galaxy, and now they were facing an enemy they couldn't even begin to comprehend. The Deathworlders were not just invading. They were changing the galaxy forever. The galaxy had long believed that it was the top of the food chain, that no species could possibly rival the might of the Council's fleet. But in that moment, they realized the truth. They had been wrong. They had been living in a false sense of security. And now, the Deathworlders were about to show them just how fragile their empire really was. The Council, desperate and overwhelmed, sent out a desperate plea for help to all corners of the galaxy. But it was too late. The Deathworlders had already claimed their first victory, and the galaxy was now in their sights. The galaxy would never be the same again. And no one, not even the mighty Council, could stop what was coming. The Deathworlders' march through the galaxy seemed unstoppable. Systems fell one by one. Colonies that had once thrived under the protection of the Galactic Council now lay in ruins. Cities burned, and entire species were driven to the brink of extinction. The survivors, if there were any, cowered in fear, unsure of what to do or where to go. The galaxy had always prided itself on its technological superiority. For centuries, it had been the pinnacle of civilization, with a vast network of planets working in unison. But all of that was unraveling before their eyes. The Deathworlders weren't just fighting for land or resources. They were fighting for something far darker. They were determined to break the galaxy, to prove that their savage ways were the only truth in this galaxy. Every attempt to counter the Deathworlder fleet ended in failure. A united front was impossible. The Council tried to rally the other species, but they were all too busy trying to save their own skins. Each planet, each species, had their own priorities, their own struggles. Some factions tried to remain neutral, thinking they could avoid the chaos, but the Deathworlders had no mercy for those who stood by. The Council sent its best fleet, a massive force of warships and powerful war machines, to confront the Deathworlders. It was their strongest fleet, one that had stood undefeated in countless battles. But as the fleet approached the edge of a nearby system, they were greeted not by resistance, but by silence. The Deathworlders had laid a trap. Suddenly, massive warships appeared from every direction, surrounding the Council's fleet with terrifying precision. These ships were designed for war in ways the galaxy had never seen. Their weapons systems, unlike anything the Council had encountered, fired with deadly accuracy. Energy beams sliced through shields like paper, and explosions erupted from every corner of the battlefield. The Council's fleet was overwhelmed in minutes. Ships that had once seemed invincible were torn apart like toys in the hands of a child. The Deathworlders didn't just fight. They slaughtered, making sure to inflict the maximum amount of damage before moving on to their next target. It wasn't enough to destroy the fleets. No, the Deathworlders enjoyed making their enemies suffer first. The survivors of the attack fled, barely escaping with their lives. The news of the defeat spread quickly, and fear swept through the galaxy. The Deathworlders weren't just powerful, they were ruthless. They fought with a savage brutality that no one had ever seen before. They didn't care about treaties or diplomacy. They didn't care about the rules of war. All that mattered to them was winning, and they would stop at nothing to do so. Meanwhile, the Deathworlders' message was broadcast across the galaxy. You are weak. Your systems are broken. Your fleets are worthless. Submit or face your annihilation. The galaxy was in a state of complete chaos. The Council, once a symbol of strength, was now struggling to maintain control. Species that had once been proud to be part of the greater galactic community now saw their world slipping through their fingers. Those who had once dismissed the Deathworlders as nothing more than an isolated threat now understood the truth. The Deathworlders were not an enemy. They were a force of nature. No one was safe. The Deathworlders moved through the galaxy like a plague, destroying everything in their path. The Council's attempts to rally any sort of defense were hopeless. They were outmatched, outclassed, and outgunned. The Deathworlders were simply too strong, too savage, and too determined. The galaxy's hope had been extinguished. But as the Deathworlders continued their march, there were whispers of something stirring in the darkness, a resistance forming among the remnants of the galaxy's once proud civilizations. Whether it was a mere flicker of hope or a last-ditch effort to resist the inevitable, no one knew for sure. But one thing was certain: the galaxy wasn't going to fall without a fight. The galaxy trembled under the Deathworlders' iron grip. Every corner of known space was under threat. The Galactic Council, once the supreme authority, had fallen into disarray. Some species tried to negotiate with the invaders, offering their resources and planets in exchange for survival. Others had no choice but to flee, hiding in the furthest reaches of the galaxy. But among the despair, something unexpected was happening. In the darkness of forgotten space, a small group of survivors began to form. They were not soldiers, not military commanders. They were ordinary people from different races: scientists, engineers, traders, and even former soldiers who had lost everything to the Deathworlders. But they had one thing in common: the fire to resist. They called themselves the Rebel Alliance, and they were determined to bring the fight to the Deathworlders, no matter how impossible it seemed. They knew that the odds were against them. The Deathworlders were too powerful, their fleet too vast, their tactics too brutal. But they also knew that the galaxy couldn't simply kneel and give up. The very idea of submitting to a race so savage, so merciless, was unbearable. It was not just a fight for survival, it was a fight for freedom. The first step was to gather any ships they could find: old freighters, decommissioned warships, and civilian vessels, all scrounged together from the shattered remnants of once thriving civilizations. The fleet was small, barely a fraction of the Deathworlders' power, but it was all they had. The survivors knew they had to be smart. Every battle would be a test of strategy, not strength. Their first target was a Deathworlder outpost on a remote planet. It was a small, insignificant base, barely worth the attention of the Deathworlders. But to the rebels, it was an important first step. If they could destroy it, they would prove that they were capable of striking back. They needed a victory, however small, to show the galaxy that resistance was possible. The rebel fleet approached the planet under the cover of darkness, relying on stealth and misdirection. The Deathworlders were ruthless, but they were also predictable. Their outposts were heavily fortified, but the rebels knew the weak spots, the small gaps in their defenses. Using old maps and intelligence from defectors, the rebels had located the perfect point of attack. The battle that ensued was brutal. The Deathworlders were not easily caught off guard, and their response was swift. But the rebels had the element of surprise on their side. With a combination of clever tactics, sabotage, and sheer determination, they managed to infiltrate the base. Explosions rocked the planet as their bombs went off, shaking the foundation of the Deathworlder forces. But it wasn't just about the explosions. The rebels had a message to send. They weren't just attacking a base. They were declaring war. As the Deathworlders' forces tried to regroup and retaliate, the rebel ships moved in, striking again and again. It wasn't a victory by traditional means. There were no grand battles or sweeping defeats, but they caused chaos, confusion, and panic among the invaders. When the smoke cleared, the rebels had destroyed the base. It was a small victory, yes, but it was a victory nonetheless. The message was clear. The Deathworlders were not invincible. They could be challenged, and they could be defeated. The galaxy was no longer willing to kneel. As the rebel fleet retreated, leaving the burning wreckage of the Deathworlder base behind, the survivors couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. They had struck a blow against the invaders, and for the first time in what felt like ages, they felt like they had a chance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fuel their resolve. The galaxy had not been conquered yet, and now, the Deathworlders would know that someone was fighting back. The news of the small but significant victory spread like wildfire across the galaxy. It wasn't just a win for the rebels. It was a spark that ignited a fire of hope in the hearts of those who had been crushed under the weight of the Deathworlders' domination. Systems that had long since fallen silent began to stir. Messages of defiance and resistance trickled in from all corners of the galaxy. The once feared Deathworlders were no longer seen as invincible. The tide of fear began to shift. But for the Deathworlders, this was not a moment of celebration. It was a threat they could not ignore. Their confidence, which had been unwavering after years of conquest, began to waver. The rebels had found a weakness, and that could only mean one thing: the Deathworlders could lose. This realization caused panic among their high command. How could they have underestimated such a small force? How could they have allowed this insignificant rebellion to grow? The response from the Deathworlder fleet was swift and brutal. They began to retaliate with all the force they could muster. Entire fleets were dispatched to crush the rebel threat before it could gain any more momentum. Every rebel stronghold, every outpost, every resistance group came under heavy attack. It was a full-scale war now, and the rebels were fighting for their lives. But what the Deathworlders didn't realize was that the rebellion had already gained more than just a victory. It had gained something far more valuable: unity. In the wake of the attack, the rebel forces had started to organize, to grow, and to strategize. What was once a scattered, disjointed resistance had now become a formidable force, one that could match the Deathworlders in cunning and willpower, if not in numbers. At the heart of this new alliance was a human commander, a woman who had once been a soldier in the Galactic Council's army. She was known only by her call sign, Phoenix. She had been among the first to rally the galaxy's disparate factions, organizing them into a unified front against the Deathworlders. Her tactics were unconventional, her strategies daring, and her leadership unmatched. The Phoenix was not just a symbol of hope for the rebels. She was the fire that kept the rebellion alive. Under Phoenix's command, the rebel fleet began to carry out increasingly bold operations. They struck at key Deathworlder supply lines, ambushed their convoys, and crippled their military infrastructure. They were not simply fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to win. The Deathworlders were beginning to feel the weight of their own overconfidence. But the Deathworlders were not without their own cunning. They quickly adapted to the new tactics, reinforcing their military presence and making their retaliations even more destructive. A massive battle was brewing, and the rebels knew that this would be their greatest test yet. If they couldn't hold their ground now, all would be lost. The galaxy watched in suspense. The rebels were outnumbered, outgunned, and under constant threat, but they had something the Deathworlders didn't: resolve. The rebels were fighting for their freedom, for their homes, for their families. The Deathworlders were fighting to maintain their empire. As the rebel fleet prepared for the impending battle, Phoenix gathered her commanders. They stood before a massive holographic map of the galaxy, the Deathworlders' fleet markers closing in. The time for secrecy was over. The rebel forces were ready to make their final stand. They had to strike a blow so powerful that the Deathworlders would know their reign was over. Phoenix's voice rang out with determination. "We may be outnumbered, but we have something they don't: courage. It's time we show them what we're truly made of." The final battle was upon them. Rebel fleets, bolstered by the unity of the galaxy's many factions, gathered in secret locations. Phoenix stood before her crew, determination in her eyes. This was it. There was no turning back now. Either they succeeded, or everything they had fought for would be reduced to nothing. The Deathworlder fleet, massive and seemingly invincible, was already approaching, its powerful weapons and warships capable of wiping out entire worlds with a single strike. But Phoenix knew something the Deathworlders didn't. They underestimated the power of the United Galaxy. It wasn't just about sheer numbers or firepower anymore. The rebels had learned from their previous battles. They had developed new tactics, stronger alliances, and most importantly, they had found a way to strike at the heart of the Deathworlders' power. The Deathworlders' flagship, a colossal vessel known as the Sovereign's Wrath, was leading the charge. It loomed large in the distance, its guns charged, ready to obliterate any opposition in its path. Its captain, the ruthless General Korek, was confident of victory. The rebels had put up a good fight, but now the Deathworlders were about to end it all. But what Korak didn't realize was that Phoenix had already anticipated this. As the Sovereign's wrath moved into position, a small fleet of rebel ships, hidden in the depths of the galaxy's outer rim, launched their attack. The first wave of rebel fighters swooped in, launching hit-and-run strikes against the Deathworlders' flanks, drawing their attention away from the true threat. Phoenix's fleet, outnumbered but not outsmarted, struck hard and fast. They knew the Deathworlders' weaknesses, their blind spots, and their overconfidence. Rebel ships dodged and weaved between the firestorms, attacking vulnerable points in the Deathworlder fleet's defensive line. Every strike was calculated, every move precise. In the heart of the battle, Phoenix led a small group of elite fighters toward the Sovereign's wrath. They had one objective: to destroy the flagship's main reactor. If they could take down the heart of the Deathworlders' command, they could cripple their entire fleet. But the path was treacherous. Deathworlder ships swarmed around them, their weapons unleashing destructive firepower, but the rebels held their ground. With every explosion, every near miss, they pushed forward, knowing that this was the only way to win. Phoenix's heart raced as her ship closed in on the Sovereign's wrath. This was the moment. If they could destroy the flagship, they could take down the entire fleet. She locked her coordinates into the ship's navigation system and gave the order. All units, target the reactor. This is our chance. The rebel fighters sped toward the massive ship, their weapons firing in synchrony. A barrage of missiles hit the flagship's shields, causing a momentary flicker. The Deathworlders responded with full force, launching counterattacks that nearly tore through the rebel formations. But the rebels pushed on, focusing all their energy on their mission. Phoenix's ship fired its last set of torpedoes directly into the flagship's weakened shields. The explosion was immense. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, with a thunderous roar, the Sovereign's wrath erupted in a violent explosion, sending shockwaves throughout the battlefield. The Deathworlders' fleet faltered. Their flagship, their symbol of invincibility, was destroyed. Panic set in. The rebel forces had done the impossible. They had struck at the heart of the Deathworlder Empire. But the battle wasn't over. The Deathworlders were retaliating with everything they had left. Their remaining warships fired wildly, trying to regain control of the situation. Rebel ships continued to dodge and strike, using the confusion to their advantage. As the Sovereign's wrath burned in space, the tide of the battle began to shift. Rebel forces, inspired by the destruction of the Deathworlders' flagship, pressed forward with renewed vigor. The once feared empire of the Deathworlders was now reeling, its leadership shattered, and its fleet in chaos. The rebels were no longer the underdogs. They had become the hunters. But Phoenix knew that the true test was not over yet. The Deathworlders still had resources, and their generals were not easily defeated. The galaxy watched in awe as the rebels fought, but the real question remained: could they truly defeat the Deathworlders, or would the Empire's wrath be too much to overcome? The aftermath of the battle was a chaotic mix of victory and uncertainty. The destruction of the Sovereign's wrath sent shockwaves across the galaxy, shaking the confidence of the Deathworlder fleet. But Phoenix knew the victory was far from complete. The rebels had fought hard and achieved a significant triumph, but the war was not over. The Deathworlders were ruthless and unpredictable. They would not simply allow themselves to be defeated without a fight. The surviving Deathworlder ships, now leaderless and in disarray, retreated toward the fringes of known space. Their once formidable fleet had been decimated, but Phoenix knew that the Deathworlders were not done yet. Their generals would regroup, gather whatever forces remained, and launch a brutal counterattack. Phoenix gathered her advisors and top commanders aboard the rebel flagship. The mood was tense, but determination was clear in every face. They had accomplished something no one had dared hope for, crippling the Deathworlder fleet. But they knew this was only the beginning. The Deathworlders would return stronger and more vengeful. The galaxy is free. For now, Phoenix said, her voice steady but grave. But the Deathworlders will not forgive this humiliation. They will come back with everything they have. One of her advisors, Captain Tarek, spoke up. We must strike now, while they're weak. We can't allow them time to regroup. Phoenix nodded thoughtfully. We need to keep up the pressure, but we must be smart about it. Our forces are still divided. The galaxy is vast, and the Deathworlders will try to isolate us one system at a time. The Council deliberated long into the night. They knew that this victory would not be the end of the war, but it could be a turning point. The galaxy had seen what humanity and its allies were capable of when united, and as word of the rebellion spread, more civilizations began to offer support, fearing the resurgence of the Deathworlders, but also hopeful that they could finally stand against them. As they prepared for what would undoubtedly be the final battle, Phoenix addressed her crew. Her words were simple but carried a deep truth. We fight not just for ourselves, but for every world under the rule of the Deathworlders, every alien who has been enslaved, every world that has suffered under their iron rule. This is our chance to free them. Her crew rallied behind her, their spirits high but eyes aware of the danger ahead. The galaxy had tasted freedom, but it would not come easily. The Deathworlders were not easily defeated. Their power, their brutality, their rage, they would come back stronger and more determined. The final battle would decide the fate of countless worlds. Victory was within reach, but so was destruction. Phoenix knew they could win this war if they stayed united and bold. But the Deathworlders were relentless, and no one knew what horrors they might unleash in their fury. As the fleets prepared for the final clash, Phoenix stood on the bridge, staring out into the void of space. The stars stretched infinitely, and the future was uncertain. Would humanity's rebellion mark the beginning of a new age for the galaxy, or would this be their downfall? The weight of history pressed heavily on her shoulders. The fate of billions now rested in the hands of those brave enough to fight.